Through interviews and oral history, this film, Pájaros Sin Fronteras, Borderless Birds, embarked on a journey, seeking answers to both ecological and social questions. How do changes in one place influence changes in another? How does the way we use the land around us relate to migration? What role do support structures play in resilience? How can we foster our own sense of community while simultaneously helping birds? A comparison of place, this film explores the similarities and differences between bird species in East Central Florida and Puerto Rico, and looks at ways communities can unite around multifaceted solutions to conservation challenges.
Scrub exist on the old tops of the sand dunes that used to be, when Florida was, and sea level was much, much higher than it is today. You had all these islands, these sandy islands that ran down the center of the state of Florida, and later on you had these islands that are closer to the coast. Scrub is very tied to that high, drouthy, sandy soil. One characteristic plant are these dwarf oaks, call them scrub oaks. And so those scrub oaks are critical to scrub jays. Now, the Florida scrub jay only exists in Florida, Central Florida. The range used to be all of Central Florida, and we've now lost 90% of that population. The scrub is high value land. It's high, it's dry, and it's easy to develop in Florida. During most of the year, scrub jays eat insects as their major food source, but in the wintertime those insects aren't available. So scrub jays actually go out and collect the acorns from these scrub oaks, and they hide them. They will collect an acorn. They collect 6 acorns. At one time, they can get 6 acorns in their mouth. This is a bird about the size of a blue jay, right? But they can carry 6 acorns at a time. And they come along and they lay those out in a row, and they pick one of them up. They dig a hole with their beak. They put the acorn in it. They pound it down. They cover it up, and then they take a stick or a twig and a leaf and lay on top of it. They do this in a whole patch. And they will hide 7,000 to 8,000 acorns a year. And they can find about 80% of them. Another interesting thing with scrub jays, they live in family units. These family units, they don't really interact very much with each other. But if there is a threat they need help with, they will put out a call for help. And you will see scrub jays from all over the preserve flying in to help protect a family who is threatened. When we first started 35 years ago, we did not believe that you could translocate scrub jays. So we would move scrub jays, and they would never stay where we put them. We'd put them in a new site, and they would leave, and they would spend the rest of their lives trying to get back home. We thought that was territorial, that they wanted to find their home territory. But what we learned was, no, they were looking for their family. Once we learned that, we moved the entire family. They will settle down and occupy their new territory. So these birds that currently are losing their habitat through development, we'll be able to translocate those birds from the site where the development is occurring. In the 1800s, when Florida was first being surveyed out, the federal law required every 16th section in a township has 36 sections, every 16th section would be set aside for education. As development continued to occur principally in Deltona, more of the population today is in Deltona, in Volusia County. It just so happened that the Section 16 in Deltona was this very nice piece of overgrown scrub. And so I was looking at that. Same time, a developer of shopping centers was offering the school board a tremendous amount of money. So we did an inventory, we did a count, we did mapping. And we came up with a detailed plan of where scrub jays were at that time. And at the end, the school board chose that plan over having it being developed as a shopping center. And now you have the library there, and you have the Lyonia Environmental Center, a center that is dedicated to teaching about scrub and protection of scrub. So Margaret Hames was one of the leading environmentalists in Brevard County when I was there. Margaret was the one that we all looked to for a whole range of environmental issues in Brevard County. She was the expert. And so she was significantly older. She was in her 70s when I was in my 30s. And so when Margaret was getting ready to retire, move away, she came to me and she told me that I had a task. She was assigning me this task. And the task was to be certain that our grandchildren would still have scrub jays to see.
Doris Leeper was the founder of Atlantic Center for the Arts here in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. She was an artist, a visual artist, a painter, as well as a sculptor, and an environmentalist before that word was even a thing back in the 60s and 70s. And she worked really tirelessly to protect a lot of the natural landscape around New Smyrna Beach and eastern Volusia County, with advocating for Canaveral National Seashore to become a national park in 1975, as well as Spruce Creek Preserve is in her name. And that's large swaths of land that are now hopefully protected for all eternity, that are closed off from development and give us this amazingly tranquil location that we are able to retreat to and enjoy being in close contact with nature. Sounds can tell us so much about the environment, not only from an inspiration standpoint, but also scientists can take this same data, especially with sound field recordings, and be able to tell the biodiversity of an area by listening to what species, especially birds, are incorporated into that area. It's a great tool for scientists if they cannot visually locate certain species. They just put a microphone out and are able to hear the species. As we would look with a microscope, we can hear using a microphone. It's really important to consider birdsong and birds as a species as an indicator to the health of our environment. I think of a canary in a coal mine. They're able to tell us exactly what the environment is doing if we listen. And that's listening in the sense that we are being aware of what's around us. It's not just with our ears, it's with our body, it's with all our senses. Just taking a moment to slow down and learn what our ancestors already knew.
We're so busy all the time with devices in our pockets ringing and notifications and all this sorts of stuff and trying to keep up with things, and I'm just as guilty of that as the next person. But taking opportunity to be in nature, to slow down and just kind of take it all in, helps us as humans get back to our full capacity for the range of intensity that we're capable of taking in. We had a really unique situation here in 2020 with the pandemic and the lockdowns where that really minimized a lot of human activity, and seeing what happened with the natural soundscape in kind of response. But I still say that with the caveat of I don't know that we're going to know quite what that sounds like until we look at it 2 and 3 years out to see, as we start busying ourselves again with our engines and such, what kind of impact that has on biodiversity in the future. It's intentional on my part to get out there and start documenting what these soundscapes are like now, just from what we're hearing and what we're being told about the changes in the environment, warming ocean, sea level rise, those sorts of things. We're probably going to hear a big change in the soundscape in the coming years. And so that's why I felt it was important to be out there documenting what it sounds like now so that we have a record to compare against potentially what it sounds like in the future.
Think about, the people who lived here before, whether it was a generation ago with Doris Leeper or multiple generations ago with the indigenous people who lived out in these islands. To understand our past is super important, but to be able to project to the future, like what peoples will come after us and what will those people want and need that we need to make sure to leave for them. The sediments that are back here, that are being delivered in from the landscape, the mangroves hold that sediment in place. They accumulate that sediment. The land is growing with the accrual of that sediment. And the mangroves continue growing up on top of that. And the land is growing. Is it growing as fast as sea level is rising? It depends. But we have to facilitate that growth of sediment and growth of land. It happens on the front side too with the dunes. So, when we leave that rack that comes in, that seaweed, that becomes an architecture that holds the sand, that blows across it or that washes across it. And then the dunes can rebuild. Hurricane Matthew may erode it out, carve it out, but then Hurricane Irma, because the storm came at a different angle, and it brought the storm surge in and it brought all of this material that deposited. So Matthew took it away, Irma brought it back. We've got sea level rise happening, but can we facilitate dune regeneration faster than sea level rise is scooping it out? And is that possible? I think it is, if we would just prioritize protecting those natural processes, both geomorphological as well as biological. The plovers are nesting in the dunes, depositing nutrients, allowing the dune vegetation to grow, to hold those growing dunes in place. Like, it's all connected. Certainly, a lot of people have studied these connections between places, how mobile species like birds or even migrating wildebeest or anything that move, whales that might move from place to place seasonally or annually, how they actually transport not just themselves but all of the resources that are a part of their bodies as they move, that they've taken on in one place and then deposited someplace else. So those connections across space are just, they're part of how this world works. That's, we often think about our ecosystems as, as islands in isolation, but really everything is connected to everything else. Our seabirds really are global indicators of a world in crisis, whether that's about them taking up plastics, macroplastics and microplastics in their guts, whether it's about, the impact of overfishing and of bycatch on bird populations, certainly changes in ocean temperature and the relocation, again, talking about space and time, the relocation of fish populations is disrupting seabird foraging habits. Every single thing that is happening in our world is impacting seabird populations. And so they have really, in fact, become one of our most kind of tangible indicators of the health of the planet. And yeah, if only we would pay attention to them and listen to the messages they're sending us, literally following their populations and seeing where they're thriving and where they're declining, should give us clues about what's going on both in those places and the other places that those birds are connected to. Sometimes a decline in a population of birds in Puerto Rico is not about a problem in Puerto Rico. It's about a problem in the other place that those birds live or that they travel through.
Kind of the easiest way to categorize why birds migrate. There's generally two reasons. You're either going after food or you're going after a mate. The Atlantic flyway, which is more kind of looking from the northeastern parts of Canada down through Florida, is also a Pan-American flyway, which is why we get a lot of our birds are shared not only with the Caribbean islands, but even as far south as Patagonia and Chile. So along the way, they're going to be looking for food sources. Stopover sites are places that are critical habitat for birds to be able to essentially rest, refuel, and recharge before they have to continue their migratory pathway. Some birds are capable of doing these really long distance single shot migrations, and they'll fly for literally days on end. But a lot of birds do actually take advantage of the fact, especially on the Atlantic flyway, where we do have these wonderful coastal stopover sites, that they can drop down back onto the earth and get the food that they need, get the insects, the berries, whatever it is, fatten up a little bit more and then keep heading south or keep heading north if they're on their return trip. Especially for the Atlantic flyway, a lot of our critical stopover sites are coastal sites. And those sites are particularly susceptible to things like sea level rise or saltwater intrusion that come with the territory of climate change. They also are more likely to be washed away in severe storms, for example. So some of the critical habitat that they need may not be there when they come back again. So say a bird's heading south in fall migration and they stop at a particular coastal wetland site, everything's fine. They refuel, they head south to wherever they're planning to spend the winter, say in Colombia, and they are on their way back north in the springtime, and they try to go to that same wetland site and they find that it's not what it used to be. It's a little bit like if you took a road trip and you thought you were going to make it to the next gas station because Google Maps told you, for example, there's a gas station 15 miles up the road and you're confident you can make it to there, and you get there and they're out of fuel, or the gas station closed down and Google Maps wasn't aware of it. Your car physically cannot continue at that point if you have no gas. And a sort of similar thing can happen to birds who come across places that have been historic stopover sites that are no longer valuable in that way. So as that happens, and more of these critical stopover sites are starting to be converted to habitat that is just not as productive or valuable in the same way as it has been historically for birds, you can envision that lots of birds might be traveling along pathways that they've used for several years and think that they can make it to their next stop and they'll be fine. And they get there and they don't have the food that they need. And unfortunately, a lot of birds don't complete their migrations because of situations like that, whether it's driven by climate change or it's human modification of these systems. Some of my best memories of birds in Puerto Rico are actually about a reinita that took up residence in the clothespin bag that my grandmother has on her porch. Every single spring, like clockwork, this little banana quit would come in and she would just build her little nest inside this little sack of clothespins. It just kind of became this expectation that Reinita's going to be there. And you just have to know, okay, it's getting to be about that time of year. We got to move the clothespins over, leave the sack there for her with some clothespins so she knows she can still use it. But we got to like stash some somewhere else or else no laundry is going to get done for the next few months. Despite pretty intensive development and rapid development that has happened on the island, there's still some birds that are a little bit more cosmopolitan and able to just adapt to continue living with humans. And I think reinitas are a really great example of that.
I've been here since 9:30. I haven't heard a single bird. I haven't seen a single bird. We're in an oak forest here. We should be hearing tufted titmice and blue-gray gnatcatchers and things like that constantly, and we're not hearing anything like that because the birds have just, we've lost billions of birds over the last 35, 40 years. Insecticides have a lot to do with that. Habitat loss. You drive out along LPGA Boulevard and areas that 20 years ago, the sound of Chuck Will's widows out there was just deafening almost. Dead silent now because it's all that habitat has changed. It's no longer pine flatwoods. We're also losing birds when they're in migration, when they've migrated down to Central and South America. The habitat changes down there. A bird migrates down there and gets to an area that last year was beautiful rainforest, and this year has been turned into a palm plantation. These birds migrate 14,000 miles a year round trip or more. A bird that's expended that much energy gets to a place where it expects to be able to refuel itself, and the food's not there, so the bird ends up dying along the way. Migration takes a big toll out of bird populations every year. And a number of shorebirds use those islands, Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and some of the other smaller Caribbean islands as stopping and refueling places on their migration. But they'll take off from Puerto Rico and fly nonstop all the way to New York. I mean, 6,000 to 7,000 miles, 4 or 5 days of constant flight. It's just mind-boggling that a bird that weighs 6 or 7 ounces can do that. And they do it every year, and they've been doing it for millions of years. But again, there's been such a reduction in population that, you know, we just don't see the things that that our grandparents saw. In 1973, I was a lineman down in Miami. Florida Power and Light is kind of at least the lineman section of the outside guys, is kind of a macho organization. If you watched football over the weekend, or you went out drinking with your buddies over the weekend, well, that's what you talked about on Monday morning. If you went looking at birds, you better not open your mouth and say that, because you would never hear the end of it. I mean, these guys could be absolutely brutal. So I had no idea that the guy sitting next to me, my apprentice, had been a birder since he was 9 years old when his grandmother got him started. So we're sitting in the truck, and we're waiting for the other half of our crew, and they were broke down on the side of the expressway. So we're waiting and waiting, and this little flock of sparrows goes flying across the ground in front of the truck, and this bird that, to me, kind of looked like a mockingbird, flew down and nailed one of these little sparrows to the ground and killed it right in front of us. Ricky Ray, my apprentice, jumped out of the truck, ran back to his car, grabbed his camera. He is so excited he's about to pee in his pants. And I had no idea what the bird was. Like I said, to me this bird looked like a mockingbird. Well, it turned out that the bird was a loggerhead shrike. The shrike picked up the body of this little dead sparrow and flies around to the far side of the power company yard, 3-strand barbed wire on top of the fence, impales that little sparrow on the barbed wire, pecks at it until the body drops to the ground, picks the head up, flies over a few feet, impales the head over here on another piece of barbed wire. Another shrike, which was over in a tree over here about 6-8 feet away, flies over and starts feeding on the head. First shrike picks up the body of the sparrow, impales it again, starts peeling off strips, and flies about 6 feet over to where it had 3 babies in the nest. Now this whole little drama took at least a half hour to play out. And I was just lucky enough that I had somebody there who could identify what the birds was, explain to me what was going on. I was absolutely blown away. I thought, if there's these kind of dramas playing out around us all the time, I better start paying attention and see what's going on.
The Caribbean is really, it's an interesting island change, because it's kind of an arch shape. So it basically has birds that in some point came from South America, following the Lesser Antilles, and some species who came from this Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula, via Cuba, but also has North American influence, Florida. So let's say red-tailed hawk in Florida, but there's also other species of hawks that also might be using the resources that the red-tailed hawk is not available to use, because other species are more suitable to get those resources, right? So because you have Cooper's hawk, sharp-shinned hawks, you might have red-shouldered hawk, short-tailed hawks, some migratory or wintering goshawk, and then you have at night, you have a bunch of owls, right? So the red-tailed hawk in Florida is using a niche this size, for example, because all the interactions with other species. But what happens if you put a red-tailed hawk in an island with very few or sometimes no competition at all? That ecological niche get expanded, because the ecological niche is so tight and is so defined by all the interactions in the community. Some species tends to be more specialized because they have been in an island for a long time. I mean, I grew up in Mexico. I'm a tropical creature, and I've been kind of working a lot in the tropics, and I'm used to see a bunch of other tropical species that they are not in islands. But then I can understand, like, okay, that's a natural process. You read the island biogeography theory, you have some explanations there, and blah, blah, blah. Logically, that makes sense to me. But then when you see that El Yunque is an island inside of an island, is when you start seeing that the species that should be there, they're not there anymore. So you have this beautiful forest, but the edges are so sharp, the transition is so sharp, basically from second growth forest to concrete, right? So you don't have that smooth transition that you will see in Maricao or El Toro Negro in western Puerto Rico, places like Maricao. Then you can start seeing the endemic species and the ones who are more specialized, like the elfinwood warbler, like the Puerto Rican tanager, right, who lives they live in the mountains. So they have more connectivity, but El Yunque is just a giant island. The Puerto Rican sharp-shinned hawk is a tiny version of the sharp-shinned hawk in the mainland. So they're like a 20% smaller. Raptors are territorial birds, right? So the territory means that they are highly dependent of the resources in one space. So what happened with a huge disturbance events like a hurricane, those territories are gone. So Toro Negro and Anguilarte was devastated by Maria. Over there, we have like around 60 identified individuals. And after the hurricane, we were only able to locate 21. So what we saw is just basically just sticks. And most of the trees that survived were palms. But even the trees that survived, they lost all the branches. They lost all the limbs. So structurally, even if they survive, they don't have the structure that the sharp-shinned hawk needs to build the nest. The effects of the hurricane not only is reflected in the vegetation, it's reflected in how the birds' communities are arranged in that area. In the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, for example, you can see some of the effects in the vegetation that the Mayas did. The distribution of some species of trees, they're following a distribution that was influenced by the Mayan use of the land. So yeah, so disturbances are really important and can just shape, the distribution of species all over. Mm-hmm. So, and hurricanes are the main natural disturbance in the Caribbean.
Yo ya había vivido experiencias con otros huracanes, pero pues con María fue algo totalmente diferente. Pasamos mucha necesidad porque tuvimos 5 meses sin los servicios básicos que fueron agua y luz. Y pues tuvimos que adaptarnos a una serie de cambios. Sobrevivimos. Reaccionó de forma positiva, todos nos unimos, cada cual puso de su parte, limpiamos entre todos, nos ayudamos unos a otros. Cuando el vecino no tenía, yo llevaba para allá y viceversa. Se creó más unión en cuestión de vecinos que antes, ¿entienden? Que en circunstancias normales. De las cosas negativas que nos trajo María, logramos sacar algo positivo. Un ejemplo que te puedo dar, inmediatamente, ya pasó la emergencia, que pasó el huracán, Mi esposo bajó con una máquina de cortar palo, porque el camino se cerró, y él empezó a cortar palo. Inmediatamente empezaron a llegar vecinos con otras herramientas, y entre todos empezaron a cortar hasta que abrieron el camino. Personas en el área, en el perímetro de aquí de esta área, que sí abandonaron sus casas y se movieron a la Florida, muchas personas. Luego de eso también hubieron muchas personas que no se movieron ellos, pero enviaron a sus hijos a estudiar con sus familiares fuera, porque tuvimos un año con las escuelas cerradas. Muchos familiares vinieron y enviaron sus hijos con otros familiares fuera de Puerto Rico para que continuaran estudiando por allá. Y también otra cosa, que muchas familias que perdieron todo, porque en esta situación de María, muchas familias perdieron todo, pero FEMA no ayudó a todos. Y muchas de las familias que perdieron los reubicaron fuera de Puerto Rico.
Many friends, they left Puerto Rico because of the economic situation of the island. It got worse with the earthquakes, of course. It got worse now with COVID situation, right? But many, I've heard of many coming back too, because many people are hearing that it's not that bad anymore here. And the economy is starting to move again. You have, of course, your share of poverty, which is very big, especially in the mountains. And that was, Hurricane Maria exposed that. Oh, people helping each other. Even if my roof was gone and yours, let's go and work on yours first, and then we'll go work on mine. Because we're not gonna wait for anyone to help us. It was so that big, and if the governments, even on the U.S. and Puerto Rico, wanted to help, it was so overwhelming that we had to take it. We had to do it ourselves first. You can bring as much help as possible, or the local government can do as much help as possible, but the police officer lost his roof, and he's directing traffic, and his family is on a neighbor's house or a family house. So that's what really, that happened a lot here. I work with hurricane relief efforts in Puerto Rico, and it was funny because I was transporting missionaries around the island while they were working. I was bird watching. And it was mostly curious of what was going to happen with the birds because of the hurricane. 90% of my family is in Florida. Okay. I have a couple of my sister, nephews, and nieces here. But most of my family's out there. I have a cousin that I've been, teaching her about bird watching, and she started already in Orlando. She loves it. She wants to buy a camera already. So it has been a slow migratory season. Slower than, since I started on this, it has been the slowest. It's weird. Usually by this time we see a lot more. Very proud of my people, very proud of Puerto Ricans, very proud of my birds. I think they're amazing because we Puerto Ricans are very intense on everything. If we go bird watching, we're intense on that. If we love music, we're intense on that. Sports, we're intense on that. We do our best on that. And that's what makes us Puerto Ricans, Definitely.
It's a natural process. Right. There were hurricanes before, but the thing that has changed is, hurricanes became stronger and more frequent. So that's the difference. The studies that we made after this hurricane can be compared with the ones that was made after Hurricane Georges too. So there is things to be, that you can compare. Things are made different now. There's more technology. There's more data. People are more involved, the common people, like me, on submitting data, especially through eBird. Now on your phone you can you can report a bird, and 2 minutes later somebody is watching the bird. So that is changing a lot, and we can have better results for in the next years when more and more data is collected. Interestingly, I did my first trip 2 months after Maria. Definitely the population of some birds, the ones that depends more on fruits, kind of decline in terms that they weren't found in the regular spots, but that's obvious because there's no fruits, so they look for them in other places. We actually been seeing changes in some species, especially in the frequency we see X or Y species. It's better to wait for the next maybe 10 more years to see the trends, because we don't have anything to compare this amount of data we've been collecting since eBird starting to be part of our daily birding life. I was talking with a friend recently about especially the ducks. We've seen a decline in duck species passing through and numbers. That can be, you know, attributed to maybe the warmer winters in the north. Ducks stays in south, you know, in Florida, maybe is an example. If there's no reason to keep going because, you know, there's no really cold temperatures there. At least ducks is one of the things that I've been seeing the changes in the recent years.
One of the big differences between Florida and the Caribbean is that there's often other habitat nearby for birds and plants to move back into the area. Usually, you know, hurricanes will go across part of Florida and the migrant birds will go somewhere else that wasn't hit by the storm. But in Southeast Florida, where the development has come in so much, you know, Fort Lauderdale, Miami area like that, they do have little pockets of habitat down in there. Hugh Taylor Birch State Park has some really nice habitat in there, but one of the hurricanes that hit that area really knocked out the small patch of maritime hammock that's in there. And in the historic landscape, that would have been fine because, you know, the animals and birds could have moved to other habitat. The plants could have recolonized from that habitat and come back into that area. But now it's surrounded by, you know, urban areas. And so there's no seed source to recolonize there. There's no place for the birds to go to. So we created, in effect, little islands along the southeast coast of Florida through development there. So hurricanes can have a much greater impact on those small areas. And that can be true of any kind of island habitat.
It's been a couple of years since Maria. You know, it all started aggressively planting after Hurricane Maria.
Okay.
And this is like our second year as an official reforestation unit. Our goal is to plant 10,000 trees in this reserve this year, and then 50,000 trees island-wide by the end of the year. So that's what we're doing, trying to reintroduce whatever we think is native and endemic to the place. Most of our work is with communities, especially after the storm. So basically, right now, you know, we're giving out trees to whoever is compromised. If you know you're going to plant a tree, and you make that agreement with us, then you can take at least 20 trees with you to wherever you are, your community, your home, or any different space, and plant them over there. We just moved to biodegradable bags.
Oh, nice.
So now we can plant with the bag, and that helps a lot. And then now we have an app that just came out. So the idea is to be able to plant collectively, and then gather all the info in the app all together. We also started producing now different bushes and herbs as well that grow inside the forest. So that's like the next step that we're trying to go into.
People have this love-hate relationship with birds. My favorite bird, it's the Antillean grackle. It's what in science they call a synanthropic species. It's a species that, wild species that flourishes in the presence of humans. They're noisy and loud, and they're gregarious. So they have all these characteristics that makes them a nuisance. But in reality, it's a reflection of how humans are too. Loud and gregarious. That's why I like them. The other aspect is that they tend to nest in groups. And I say that if we were more like the changos, probably we would have a better living standard in Puerto Rico. We shared more time with our neighbors after Maria.
How do you see that in relation to COVID now?
It's different because COVID it's asking us to isolate ourselves and distance ourselves. In that sense, it has brought families together, but not at the neighbor level.
In your opinion, what could help with facilitating that sense of community again, even in COVID?
I would say like open green spaces in cities. Having more open green spaces in cities. Spaces to interact at a safe distance, in a safe environment, and habitat for birds. Urban green spaces. That's what we need. That's what will save us in the 21st century.
Sometimes we lose that connection to how important green spaces are. I lived in Fort Lauderdale before. I had a very green yard there. And there was one day I went out to get in my car and I had a bird bath, and it was during migration, and I had 9 different species of warbler in and out of my bird bath. And when I moved to North Florida, I said, you know, where are all the birds? Well, there is a lot more green space here, so they spread out. And it really brought home to me how critical that little green space is. Like you say, that one tree in the parking lot, which is the only place for them to go. National Audubon several years ago started a Plants for Birds campaign program. And this is based on a book and the thinking of Dr. Doug Tallamy, who's actually a professor, an entomologist. Native plants have evolved with the soils wherever we are, let's say the soils of Florida, and those native plants have natural hosts. Many caterpillars and butterflies, moths, that type of thing. And that 95-96% of all songbirds require protein to feed their young, and also need protein just to bulk themselves up for migration, etc. So when we remove the native plants from the landscape, we are removing a really, really critical component for birds. And they've done studies, he's done studies with his students that say that about 80%, 75 to 80% of a yard should be in native vegetation in order to support, let's say, a breeding pair of chickadees. So same thing goes for migration. If you don't have these green spaces for birds to stop and recharge in this flight, they are not going to make it. They're going to starve. So, you know, I imagine that little black and white warbler flying across the Gulf, and they actually absorb a lot of their digestive body parts because they need that energy to fly. When they arrive, they're desperate. They've got to recharge. And if they arrive and let's say they're in Miami and it's all concrete, what do? So having people start to be aware of planting native plants, having green spaces, and we have a lot of green spaces, but so many of them are filled with exotics. And those exotics don't support the native species of insects, and that's why those spaces are really, really important. And it's a movement that's actually taking off quite well. And in fact, Doug Tallamy he's creating a new kind of national park, which is a series of connected green spaces all over the country, so that we can have these spaces for birds. I mean, right now with the COVID and people being very restricted in terms of what they can do, there's been a huge surge in interest in outdoor spaces and green spaces. And in fact, a huge surge in the interest in bird watching and learning about the birds in your yard or feeding the birds in your yard. And yet, the theory of green spaces as places to rejuvenate, to make you feel good have been around forever. Now, that's just one small part of it, though. I mean, we have to understand that our green spaces provide shade. So for climate, they're good. They provide oxygen. So for our health, they're good. They provide spaces for insects. And without our insects and pollinators, we would have no fruits and vegetables, or very few. We would have no new trees, because the insects feed the birds eat the fruits, they disperse the seeds. So there's so many things that people don't think about that are important for green spaces, because once those green spaces disappear, I'm not sure that we're not too far behind. The green spaces are places where people feel good and come together. I think community happens on all kinds of different levels, from both the local people using it to creating kind of a statewide and even a national community. But when you think about the fact that habitat is the biggest challenge, habitat loss, that's really something we can do something about.
What we can do is make sure that our urban developments still celebrate diversity. How can we do our landscaping in our neighborhoods? How can we do our landscaping around our commercial developments to actually still prioritize diversity, to minimize pesticides and other toxins, to invite back in the species that were there originally, that we've displaced? Is there a way to develop that allows us to coexist with the species who had this space even before we took it over?
So on a personal level, if you have a garden, or even if you just have a balcony, you can do a lot to plant native plants, especially things that are fruiting or might attract pollinators and insects. These are really critical foods for migratory birds, especially if you actually own a home and you have a garden. There's a lot of resources online to create backyard habitat, especially to sort of replace some stopover sites that might not be protected, that birds might be losing. And any sort of green patch that a migratory songbird can find on its way south for the winter can be the difference between life and death. Birds are showing us, and birds tell us every day, that they are resilient and they're capable of confronting these major challenges that they've done for generations, like migration, and major challenges that they're facing for the first time ever, like climate change or stopover sites being developed. If there's any way in which I think humans are particularly bird-like, it's that we are exceptionally resilient. So I think that resilience is really what unites us more than anything, regardless of our background.